Chapter 3. Yorkshire. 1 week later. Gabriel took one look at Miss Haywood and instantly regretted inviting her. From one of the tall windows of his private office that overlooked the front terrace, he had surveyed the relentless procession of carriages pass through the 2-story gatehouse since the hour of 10. Their guests were arriving one atop another within the inner courtyard, making him suspect they all had considered it a veritable race to be the first welcomed into his ancestral home. For a moment his mood darkened at this intrusion into his private world, but it was of his own making and simply had to be done. He reminded himself he'd predicted the sense of invasion, the orderliness teetering on a peak of chaos. However, what he did not anticipate, Gabriel mused, was the sense of impending dread settling in his bones as he stared at Miss Haywood stepping down from the Green's carriage. He didn't believe a bloody word she said about not wanting to marry his brother. A young woman of moderate means and full possession of her sanity would never run from an invitation others would do anything short of murder to obtain. Indeed, her aversion to being a divine bride could be part of a marital strategy, he thought. Perhaps she had hopes Tristan wouldn't be able to resist such a challenge. Hell, he was scarcely able to stop himself from pulling her against him in his garden in London and brushing his mouth against hers. Strikingly beautiful she was not. However, he had to admit she was adorable in such a beguiling way he had half a mind to say it astounded him. A grin tugged at the corner of his mouth as he remembered that evening and how her rich burgundy locks tumbled from the pile atop her head. Certainly she wasn't the most graceful of creatures. In fact, she was wholly unacceptable and full of flaws. If she were his ward, he'd hire a team of finishing governesses and lock them all in Wolverest's tallest tower for months, maybe even a year. Gabriel reached back, massaging the back of his neck in frustration. Miss Haywood had a reputation scattered with clumsy happenings at public functions, which he had begrudgingly deemed permissible, and a bold stepmother who nearly had her ward compromised a number of times.
She is a shameful, vexing creature who cannot dance or even play,
his Aunt Eugenia had declared, repeatedly. By those accounts, Miss Haywood's name should not have remained on the list, but Rosalind insisted the chit be placed there, claiming to admire a frank openness in her gaze and an intriguing sense of the unexpected. And, by God, his sister was spot on. Gabriel shook his head in bemusement. Why the hell did he give in to Rosalind? Miss Haywood did not belong here. He took a step closer to the tall window, heat from the afternoon sun warming his face through the glass. Miss Haywood stood there on the cobbled drive, a serene smile upon her lips, her round, dark eyes giving the impression she hid a deeply sensual nature. It was unintentional for sure. Had the silly chit known she possessed such a bewitching gaze, he was sure she would have learned to use it by now to gain numerous advantages in life. With his back to the study door, he heard his brother enter, the sound of his footsteps telling him Tristan headed straight for the fireplace.
Let us review our agreement,
Gabriel threw over his shoulder.
Spare me the idiocy of details,
Tristan remarked from his position in front of the gilt-framed mirror above the mantel. He stood dusting imaginary lint from his shoulders, but Gabriel knew what his little brother was actually doing. Tristan Everett Devine was inventing things to do that would award him more time to admire his own reflection.
I realise I cannot foist maturity on you, but damn it all, stop using your banal criticisms as a crutch to keep from taking a bride.
Gabriel frowned at his ridiculous brother, who was now examining his teeth.
I only base my scale of judgment by your example. Every man has his own preferences.
Preferences? You find a flaw with every marriageable woman who crosses your path. This one too chatty, too pale, too skinny, too plump, too short, too tall.
Gabriel finished, nearly running out of breath.
You agreed to be less discriminating.
Come,
Tristan drawled.
That's certainly no way to talk to the man who agreed to give up a life of content debauchery to make certain the title remains in our grasp. Besides, if you will recall, there always seems to be a stunning beauty by your side. You are as guilty as I.
Gabriel's scowl deepened.
I do not mislead them with inane flummery.
Tristan gave a short bark of laughter.
No, you drop them like a fireplace poker left to close to the hearth should you spot a freckle.
He dug in his waistcoat pocket but came up empty-handed for whatever it was he was looking for.
I don't like freckles.
Gabriel grumbled, remembering the ones on Miss Haywood's nose, and the pale, tiny one just above the corner of her upper lip.
Do you have any more of those peppermint drops?
Tristan asked. Without answering, Gabriel turned to his massive mahogany desk and opened the top middle drawer. He grabbed a handful of the candy and tossed it atop his desk. One rolled off and fell soundlessly to the rug. He shook his head, then remembered his task and turned back to the set of windows overlooking the front lawn. The Marquis of Fairbourne was handing down his flaxen-haired twin daughters from their carriage, as 3 servants rallied around a second conveyance laden with trunks. Fairbourne linked a daughter to each arm, puffing out his chest with apparent pride. Gabriel smiled grimly. The man obviously thought he had this thing already won. He did have double the chances, indeed, and double the worry.
Ah, the twins,
Tristan remarked from behind Gabriel's shoulder.
Remember your gentlemanly manners.
Gabriel warned in a slight mocking tone.
Mine or yours?
Both.
Gabriel muttered as he stared past the twins. Miss Haywood was in the peculiar process of removing pins from her bonnet. What the devil was she doing?
They are rather delicious looking, aren't they?
Gabriel nodded absently, answering a question he wasn't listening to. A footman moved, obstructing his view. Impatience pricked at his nerves. Finally, the robust man stepped aside, revealing a cheery-looking Miss Madelyn Haywood, patting the locks tumbling from the loose bun atop her head. Didn't she know a lady wasn't to remove her bonnet in public? But the disapproving furrow in his brow gradually relaxed. In the daylight, her dark red hair looked positively glorious, the very shade of a glass of claret held up to firelight. Ah, hell. He decided to forgive her. They were in the country after all. Finishing her task, she stood with one gloved hand shielding her eyes from the sun, the other resting on her hip, the yellow ribbons of her bonnet entwined within her fingers. The bonnet swung back and forth in the breeze, batting against the sky-blue muslin of her dress as her assessing gaze took in Wolverest Castle.
I've heard they've a particular fondness for Frenchmen.
Who?
Gabriel asked, the word mostly heir. He suddenly had no idea what his brother was talking about.
Who else? The Fairbourne twins.
Tristan popped one of the peppermint candies into his mouth.
If they like the French accents, I think I will have to indulge them, no?
Gabriel closed his eyes momentarily, shaking his head. Tristan, on occasion, could be downright absurd. His brother chuckled at his own jest, swaggering away from the window. As he passed a glass-paned bookcase, he paused to use the reflection it provided to smooth his dark hair away from his face.
Where's that French poetry book Rosie was reading last night?
I have no idea.
Gabriel answered. With any luck, Rosalind anticipated Tristan's ploy of seduction and threw it in the pond.
Pity.
Tristan said ruefully. He swept his fingers across his forehead.
I do know, however, that I don't envy you and the unsightly mark on your face.
The bruise had faded to a hideous shade of chartreuse.
How'd you come about that again?
I had a mishap in the garden back in London.
He answered distractedly. He continued to watch Miss Haywood.
Brother, if you haven't noticed, the house is rapidly filling with women who desire my attention, and I must be on my way,
Tristan said, straightening.
Quite a striking bunch, the whole lot. My only regret is I must choose only one.
Gabriel turned to find Tristan now leaning inside the doorframe.
Use your head.
He began.
Do not show favoritism. Do not insult anyone. Make your preferences and aversions known only to Rosalind and me. If you happen to make your choice before midnight on the night of the ball, you would be wise to keep it to yourself. Again, there is to be no indecent behavior, Tristan. No fake French accents. And for God's sake, show some restraint.
I will if you will.
Tristan remarked casually as he inspected his fingernails.
Are you done? I'd like to get a head start and seek them out, you know.
Seek them out?
Gabriel chuckled.
You just might have to hide.
Tristan stood, straightening his coat.
Well, thank God you're not choosing a bride, Gabriel. With all your rules of manner and dress, no doubt you'd kill her with boredom.
Gabriel's smile froze, then fell into a scowl. His little brother had no idea of the gravity of his flip comment. With an exaggerated bow, Tristan quit the room with a jaunty step into the hall. And a good thing he left when he did, Gabriel thought, just before he was about to throttle him. But it would have been wrong to blame his brother for his poorly chosen words. Tristan was too young to remember the happy, vibrant woman that was their mother, and how their father changed everything with his thoughtlessness. A high-pitched shout pulled Gabriel's attention back to the window. He looked to the grounds for a dog, for it certainly sounded akin to a canine's yip. But it was no dog. It was Miss Haywood. Her pretty little bonnet went aloft as she ran to and fro, flapping her gown as if it were on fire. Miss Green tried desperately to keep up with her friend's mad dash, but Miss Haywood was just too quick.
What the bloody hell?
Gabriel took a step closer to the window and blinked a few times after he thought the crazed woman accidentally afforded him, and the small crowd forming about her, a view of her shapely calves, not to mention her knees. She continued to flap about the drive in such a frenzied manner, she crossed the short expanse of lawn, attracting curious onlookers who began to follow. She was headed straight for the pond. He watched her edge closer to where the lawn sloped toward the water. If the girl wasn't careful, she'd fall in. And given what he'd heard had happened at the Montagues' garden soiree last spring, she didn't know how to swim. He swore, running his hand through his already tousled hair.
Doesn't that woman ever stay put?
Turning away from the window, he strode out the door. He had wanted to divulge her of his true identity privately before she embarrassed herself by addressing him improperly in front of everyone. But he couldn't let the chit drown either. In the hall, Gabriel spotted his butler standing like a marble sentinel by the open front doors. Trunks and bags of every size and shape were heaped in a pile across from him, as servants rallied to take them up to the correct rooms.
Your Grace,
The butler intoned, his face expressionless.
there seems to be a disturbance on the lawn.
Yes, Gerard, I'm aware of it.
Of course, Your Grace.
Order a bath to be readied for Miss Haywood.
When the tall, silver-haired butler acknowledged the order with a slow nod, Gabriel strode out the front doors, down the multi-level steps of the terrace, and onto the drive. An image of Miss Haywood lounging in the hip bath, water lapping against her glistening skin, rose unbidden in his mind. With a shake of his head, he pushed the thought out of his head. If he didn't curb his imagination, he'd need a dunk in the frigid pond as well. One moment she was admiring the lavender-lined path snaking around the castle, the long greyish-purple sprigs bouncing up and down as heavy bees collected their fragrant pollen. And in the next she was jumping about like a madwoman because one of those pesky little creatures found its way under and up her gown.
A bee! A bee! There's a bee!
Madelyn cried in a frantic whisper, rushing about.
Where?
Priscilla spun about, looking.
There's no bee. Under my gown.
Madelyn cried, flapping at her skirts.
It'll sting me. Well, then let it,
Priscilla said through gritted teeth.
Better to stand still and comport yourself as a lady than to flail about like a loon. Are you jesting?
Madelyn asked in disbelief, shaking and swatting her gown as she crossed the lawn.
The last time I was stung, my hand remained swollen, red and painful for 5 days. There isn't a salve in existence to save me.
Stand still so I can help you,
Charlotte urged, following Madelyn.
The Fairborns are looking at us.
Priscilla whined, trailing behind them. She looked over her shoulder.
And following us.
I say, young lady,
Lord Fairborn called out.
what is the matter?
The Baroness smiled tightly.
Not a thing, my lord.
She whipped around, growling through her teeth.
Madelyn, I demand you stop this instant.
And Madelyn did, directly at the top of a gentle slope.
Wait.
She stood perfectly still for the barest of a second.
I think it's gone.
A sigh of relief poured out of her.
It is.
Her shoulders easing down, she turned around, only now noticing how the lawn slanted sharply to a large pond.
Well, it's a good thing I didn't Ah!
An acute jab stabbed her left buttock. She whipped around, swatting at her bottom, then mistakenly stepped on her hem. And then she fell, or rather rolled, directly into the lake. Priscilla screamed, Charlotte gasped, and Madelyn, dragging herself out of the knee-deep water, tossed herself upon the grassy bank and broke into a laugh.
Oh, Maddie.
Charlotte skidded down the hill.
Are you all right?
Yes, I'm fine.
Madelyn sputtered, wiping at a swag of hair that had fallen into her eyes.
Cold, but fine. At least the water wasn't very deep over here.
I should have known you'd do something like this.
Priscilla hissed.
You clumsy cow.
I'll get help.
Charlotte said in a quiet voice, throwing a disapproving glare at the Baroness. Madelyn looked up, noticing the small crowd forming on the crest of the slope. The Fairborn twins smirked down their noses at her, though she had to admit they had no choice, as they were standing above her. And their father, the ruddy-faced Lord Fairborn, blinked at her as if she were a newly discovered bug specimen. Standing, Madelyn gathered handfuls of sopping fabric in her hands and began to wring herself out. She looked up from her task to see a young footman start down the hill. He took one look at the front of her gown and turned on his heel.
If you'd like, miss,
he said with his back to her.
I'll fetch a blanket.
And then he took off running.
Thank you,
Madelyn replied, a question in her eyes. She wondered what made the servants so uncomfortable. Of course, it probably wasn't every day that a silly woman jumped in their pond. Or, she looked down. The water had plastered the gown to her skin, making the pale blue fabric appear wholly see-through. Each rib bone, each breast, was shockingly visible in startling detail to anyone who would care to notice. Wrapping an arm across her chest for modesty's sake, she began to trudge up the hill, her sopping skirts clinging to her thighs and hampering her progress. She realized that any normal young lady would be perfectly mortified to have fallen in a pond after such dramatics in front of a half-dozen people. And really she expected to be more embarrassed tomorrow than she felt right now. But somehow she couldn't summon the humiliation. Maybe it was because she didn't care what these people thought. Or perhaps it was because, after an exhausting ride in a carriage for 4 days with her stepmother and her wealth of criticisms, the splash in the pond felt downright revitalizing. Or maybe she wasn't surprised. From an early age, she had accepted the fact that things just happened to her. Yes, that was it. Now, if she hadn't fallen into the pond, that would have been a surprise. She stopped short when a rather large-sized pair of polished Hessians came into view. Her gaze travelled up the length of the man's legs, from his knees to his athletically toned thighs covered in fawn-coloured breeches, which were sinfully snug, and stopped somewhere around his lean hips and flat stomach.
Why is it, Miss Haywood,
came a familiar deep voice,
that every time I meet you, you're quite damp and speckled with mud?
Never the one to be shy, Madelyn raised her head to meet Mr. Devine's beautiful stare, which promptly stunned her to silence. He was so remarkably handsome. How in the world did his acquaintances manage to concentrate on anything in his presence? She couldn't say anything. Her mouth just opened and shut like a fish. She probably smelled like one too, now that she thought of it. After a moment longer than she would have liked, she managed a wobbly smile. But the effect she hoped it had on him was ruined when the same wet swag of hair fell again, covering her face. He chuckled softly, smoothing it out of the way for her. She had half expected to see him here as he was related to the Devines, and they were certainly going to invite more than the potential brides and their families to even out the numbers, but she would have preferred he didn't observe her so soggy. His eyes sparkled with suppressed laughter.
What exactly was the problem, dear lady?
He crossed his arms over his chest.
Was there a problem? Or did you just feel like going for a swim?
Yes, no, there was a bee.
The footman appeared, saving her from further stuttering, and handed her the blanket. Mr. Devine pulled it from her loose hold and wrapped it snugly around her shoulders.
I'm angry with you,
she declared, suddenly remembering he had tricked her with the invitation.
And why is that?
He asked after he finished wrapping her up.
You snuck the invitation into my grasp.
She sniffled.
Did you think I'd forgotten?
Nonsense, it would have made its way into your possession somehow. I was simply helping out my man.
Your man?
Her brow knitted together.
Come, I'll walk you inside.
He surprised her by taking her hand in his large one as he guided her up the hill.
I must explain something to you. In private, and after. You can tell me just why you felt compelled to test the waters.
Nearly to the top, she found her voice again.
I would very much like to change first.
Something slimy, which she hoped was simply mud and not a leech, slid down her calf.
That is, if you think the Duke will tolerate me traipsing through his castle dripping muddy pond water everywhere.
I can assure you it's quite all right,
he said, a flash of warmth in his icy blue gaze.
But first you must allow me to clarify something that was said.
Mr. Devine,
Madelyn said on a loud sigh, trying to free her hand from his firm grasp.
I should like to freshen up a bit for...
For some reason unknown to her, everyone standing on the hill collectively gasped, and Madelyn could have sworn Mr. Devine groaned under his breath. When she opened her mouth to speak again, a blushing Charlotte shook her head hurriedly, as if she were trying to send Madelyn a signal. Puzzled, Madelyn's brow furrowed. She looked to her stepmother, whose alabaster skin turned positively crimson. Priscilla stepped forward, grabbing the wrist of Madelyn's free hand.
Please forgive her, Your Grace. The water must have influenced her sense of propriety. I'm quite certain my stepdaughter meant to address you properly, and I...
Your Grace?
Madelyn eyed Mr. Devine suspiciously.
Why did she address you as if you were...
Her voice trailed off as she studied the fading yellow crescent of a healing bruise on his forehead, then dropped to the family crest embellished on the buttons of his dark green jacket. Her mouth fell open, her eyes opening wide as the connection dawned. No, this man standing before her exuding an easy confidence was not Mr. Devine. He was a rascal, a schemer, a fraud, and she should have known better than to believe in his glittering gaze. Her skin prickled with embarrassment.
You're the Duke.
She breathed the words in a whisper of disbelief. She felt like an instant fool.
In the garden. You lied. Why would you lie?
Don't be silly, darling.
Priscilla squeezed Madelyn's hand painfully so that all 4 fingers and thumb were smashed together within her own.
His Grace hasn't a need for untruths.
She settled her apologetic gaze on the Duke.
Please, let me take her inside so I might talk to her. Settle her down. She's normally quite endearing if you just give her another chance.
Baroness.
The Duke stressed, his eyes seething with anger as they fixed on Priscilla's pleading gaze.
Kindly loosen your hold. I believe your grip is cutting off the flow of blood to Miss Haywood's fingers.
Priscilla let go instantly. With a bow of her head, she backed her way up the hill like a chastised child. As soon as the Duke returned his attention to Madelyn, his eyes softened.
I did not anticipate this. Really, how could I?
He said quietly, giving her hand that was held within his a gentle squeeze.
I had planned to capture your attention privately before...
Before what?
Madelyn asked, struggling to keep her own voice low.
Before I could humiliate myself?
I dare say.
He said with a dark look.
You seem to be doing a fine job all by yourself.
You mock me.
She whispered the words, but they still held the heat of censure. Looking at their joined hands, she pulled hers from his hold. She shot him one last reproachful glare, then grasped the blanket, threatening to slip off her shoulders. With a sniff, she trudged up the hill. He beat her to the top, blocking her path.
Wait,
he ordered, his austere expression telling her he was a man accustomed to having people do exactly as he commanded. She refused to look at him any further, choosing to fasten her angry glare at the center of his chest. For a moment there was nothing, no words, no whispering from the other guests, just the sound of her angry breathing, her chest rising and falling with the exertion it took from slogging up a steep hill in a drenched gown. Finally, his cultured tones broke the silence.
I didn't lie to you,
he said quietly, for her ears alone to hear.
That is my given name.
We both know that is not how you should have introduced yourself,
she bit out.
And it's certainly not proper for me to address you so informally.
If you care to remember, Your manner of behaviour that evening did not lead either of us to comport ourselves within the rules in which the stricture of society insists.
She looked up at him, her expression incredulous.
Why did you lie? Was this why I was chosen?
She glanced at the faces of those who stood about them, though at some distance. With the exception of her stepmother and Charlotte, everyone else grinned like imps, leaning an ear forward in desperation to overhear more of their conversation.
For a game? Am I the joke?
She swallowed hard, defiantly ignoring the voice inside her head telling her she was behaving coarsely. After a moment of silence, she shook her head, disappointed. In herself, in him. She made to take a step around him. He anticipated her move, his broad shoulders impeding her path yet again.
Indeed, I tricked you into receiving the invitation,
he said, keeping his voice low.
But if I had not, you would have run from me as you are trying to do now.
Mr. De...
Madelyn stopped herself, attempting to take control of her emotions.
Your Grace,
she said with forced sweetness.
Did it ever occur to you that there could possibly be a woman in all of England that doesn't wish to marry into your family?
No, quite frankly,
he said with an arrogant arch of his brow.
If there were, I'd consider her the silliest of fools.
I see,
she said, affronted. With a sharp tug, she grasped the slipping blanket tighter across her shoulders. Taking a cleansing breath, she forced a brilliantly fake smile as she started to tremble, not knowing if it was from anger or cold.
Please let me pass,
she said, her mask of composure slipping. In response, he looked down at her like she was a furrow box, and he, the gambler, waiting to see which card sprung next. After a long minute, he stepped aside.
Of course.
Madelyn strode past him, feeling strangely bereft that he'd given up trying to stop her. Then, thinking that a very odd feeling for her to have, she broke into a run, dashing across the lawn and on toward the castle, never slowing her pace. Halfway across the lawn, however, it occurred to her that she didn't even know where she was going. She just knew she had to get away from him and the crowd of onlookers. Oh, how the Fairborn twins must be enjoying her mortification. A doe-eyed servant girl appeared at her side, applying a running curtsy as she tried to keep up with Madelyn.
Miss, I've readied a bath for you. Your bags have been taken up.
She continued to run alongside.
I'm Jenny,
she panted.
And I'm to show you to your room.
Madelyn stopped abruptly. She turned to Jenny, who seemed more than relived for the respite.
My bath? Do you mean to say that man?
She gestured behind her with a sharp nod of her head.
That conniving rogue anticipated me falling into the pond?
I don't know, miss.
Jenny looked uncomfortable, quite like she wished one of the other servants had been assigned to see to Miss Haywood's comfort.
It would seem so. My father says the master's always thinking of things ahead of time. It's a sign of a great leader. He's very watchful, too. He probably took one good look at you and knew you'd end up in the pond.
Madelyn didn't know what she thought about that. But speaking of ends, she mused with a cringe, the pain in her own end had begun to throb fiercely.
Tell me, Jenny,
Madelyn prompted, as she continued toward the castle at a decidedly slower pace.
What remedies do you know of to soothe the pain from a wasp sting?
I don't rightly know, Mum. I've never been stung myself, but I could find out.
Please do,
Madelyn said, as she stopped at the base of the multi-tiered steps leading up to the castle's main doors. Well, there was no other way to get up them without putting one foot in front of the other. She took a step, cringed, took another step, cringed.
Oh, why do there have to be so many steps?
Pardon?
The steps. You see,
Madelyn paused to look over her shoulder, making sure no one else could overhear.
I've been stung back there.
She pointed vaguely to her backside.
Every step produces a twinge of pain.
Jenny's mouth quirked with a suppressed smile.
Whatever you do, Jenny, please do not speak of the whereabouts of the sting to another soul. I've been embarrassed enough for one day.
I shan't, Mum. I promise.
What is, Papa?